It was supposed to be just another day at the National Power Engineering Research Center. The air smelled faintly of ozone and coffee as Huang Jun strode into the lab, his lab coat perfectly starched, his hands clutching a clipboard that was more for show than actual work. Huang, an engineer by trade and a self-proclaimed obsessive perfectionist by nature, had been working at the center for nearly 10 years, and yet, this was the first time he had ever felt a bit off. Perhaps it was the combination of late nights spent over complicated circuit boards and those endless cups of strong coffee, but today, Huang felt a nagging sense that something was about to go wrong. It wasn't that he was particularly superstitious, he wasn't, but the universe had a way of messing with him when he least expected it. His colleagues, unaware of Huang's disquiet, went about their work with the same cheerful disregard for impending danger that characterized all great scientists who believed they were invincible. Dr. Liu was fiddling with a laser-guided electron microscope. James, the lab assistant, was over by the electrical grid simulation system, enthusiastically discussing the latest data with anyone who would listen. And across the room, Mei, Huang's old friend and a fellow engineer, was preparing the main power unit for a critical test. "Hey, Huang. You ready for the big test?" Mei called out, grinning as she gestured toward the console. Huang gave a half-hearted smile, adjusting his glasses. "I've been ready since yesterday," he replied. "But it still feels like something's off today." "Come on, we've done this 1,000 times, Mei laughed, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice that Huang didn't miss. Still, he shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It was probably nothing. Minutes passed, and the team readied the final settings for the power test. The goal of the experiment was simple: to send a pulse of high-voltage electricity through a new synthetic conductor that promised to revolutionize power storage. The scientists had been working on this for years, and the world was eagerly awaiting the results. If successful, it could mean a near-limitless, environmentally friendly energy supply. Huang, despite his misgivings, was at the heart of the operation, the chief engineer overseeing the final calculations. He glanced down at the monitors, adjusted the settings on the control panel, and checked his clipboard one last time. Everything was in order. Still, that strange sense of dread clawed at him. It was as if his body was preparing for something. "Everything's good to go," Mei announced. "We're starting in 3, 2, 1. The power surge began. At first, everything seemed to work perfectly. The conductor lit up, a bright blue hue shooting down the length of the wire as the energy pulsed through it. Huang held his breath, waiting for the system to stabilize. He was watching the monitors, eyes glued to the digital readouts, when a sudden flicker of light caught his attention. The screens briefly glitched, and then, everything went black. "Damn it," Mei cursed. "What the hell happened?" Before anyone could react, a deafening hum filled the room, rising in pitch and intensity. Huang felt the static electricity in the air, prickling against his skin. The air itself felt alive, charged with an energy that pulsed with a rhythm of its own. The hair on his arms stood on end. And then, without warning, a bolt of electricity shot from the main power unit, arcing toward Huang's body like a force of nature. Everything seemed to slow down in that moment. Huang barely had time to react before the bolt struck him. His body stiffened as the electrical surge coursed through him, pain unlike anything he had ever felt tearing through his veins. For a fraction of a second, his vision blurred, the edges of reality bending and warping, but then, nothing, silence. When Huang regained his senses, he was lying flat on his back, his arms spread out, and his mind was, oddly clear. His heart raced, but there was no lingering pain. Instead, he felt alive in a way he never had before. He sat up with a jolt, his eyes wide as he took in his surroundings. His colleagues were panicking, scrambling to turn off the faulty equipment, but Huang didn't hear their voices. He heard everything else. His senses were amplified. He could feel the hum of the electrical grid miles away, the flow of current coursing through wires buried deep underground. He could even sense the faintest flicker of energy in the small devices around him, the calculators, the computers, even his own wristwatch. It was as though he could reach out and touch the energy, feel its pulse like the rhythm of a living thing. That he stood up, stunned, and looked around the room. The first thing he noticed was the way the light bulbs flickered in perfect unison, as if responding to an invisible force. His breath caught in his throat. Something was different. Something had changed. "Hey! Are you okay?" May rushed over, her voice sharp with concern. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but Huang's instinctive reaction was to pull away. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. As May looked him over, Huang's gaze fell on the wall of computers. In his mind's eye, he could see the electrical currents running through the circuits, the faintest glitch in the data flow as it processed. Without thinking, his hand reached out and, just as instinctively as before, he focused on the computer. A small surge of energy shot from his fingers toward the system, the monitors blinked back to life, the data streaming across the screen in a smooth, uninterrupted flow. Huang blinked, his heart racing. He had done that. With just a thought. "Did you just fix that?" May asked, clearly baffled. I think so," Huang muttered, still in disbelief. His fingers tingled with an unfamiliar energy, a low hum that resonated within his very bones. He could feel the electromagnetic fields, the tiny currents flowing through everything around him. The next few minutes were a blur. Huang couldn't concentrate on anything but the strange sensation coursing through him. He could sense the electricity moving through every wire in the building, every circuit in the lab. The world around him seemed alive with an energy that he could no longer ignore, and then it hit him, the realization that his body was no longer just a passive observer of energy. He had become part of the flow. The electricity was in him. It was him. Huang stood there for a moment, staring at the computer screen as it hummed back to life. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of the keyboards around him felt almost too loud now. Every movement, every shift in the air, seemed magnified. He was acutely aware of everything, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above him, the quiet shuffle of May's footsteps, the low hum of the electrical systems running through the building. But more than that, it was as if his senses had sharpened, each feeling, each sound, cutting through his mind with a startling clarity. He was seeing the world differently. You did fix it," May repeated, her voice hesitant, almost fearful. She stepped back, looking at him with wide eyes. "Huang, what's going on with you?" Huang couldn't answer her. He didn't know how. The words tangled in his throat as he tried to piece together the overwhelming rush of information flooding his mind. The current running through the building felt like an electric pulse he could reach out and grab. It wasn't just in him now, it was as if he had become an extension of it. It was all so alive. The wires, the circuits, the machines, they were a part of him now. That he reached out, instinctively, and his fingers brushed lightly against the nearest wall. For a split second, he swore he could feel the flow of the power lines running just beneath the surface of the concrete. His heartbeat quickened as his body adjusted to the sensation. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose, too much information at once, but it was exhilarating. It was too much to ignore, too much to control. "May," he said softly, turning toward her, his voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "I think something happened to me during that test. I can feel the power, inside me. Everywhere." She took a cautious step closer, studying him with a growing sense of concern. "What do you mean, you feel it?" Huang's hands trembled slightly as he raised them, and without thinking, he focused on the light fixture above them. A low hum echoed through the room as the bulb flickered, then shone brighter. The air around them crackled with static. He barely moved, but the light obeyed his unspoken command. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight with amazement. "I didn't touch it. I didn't even have to think about it. It just responded." May stared at him, her expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "That's impossible." "But I saw it. I saw it happen." "You did that?" Huang swallowed, still trying to comprehend what had just transpired. It wasn't just the light bulb, it was everything. The whole room had shifted, as though the electric pulse that ran through the walls had become part of him. He could feel it, could almost control it, even from a distance. The realization sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just an accident. Something deeper, something irreversible had happened to him. What do we do now? Mei asked, her voice shaking slightly. She wasn't used to seeing Huang so out of his element. This wasn't the meticulous, in-control engineer she knew. This was someone entirely different. I don't know, Huang admitted. But I need to figure this out. This is more than just some freak accident. This power, it feels like it's a part of me now. For the rest of the day, Huang remained in a haze, unable to shake the feeling of electric current running just beneath his skin. His body was alive with it. He could feel the very molecules of air buzzing around him, pulsing with energy. Every metal surface he touched hummed with the faintest vibrations. It was overwhelming, but it was also thrilling in a way he couldn't describe. Like he had been awakened to a hidden layer of reality. That night, after everyone had left the lab, Huang stayed behind, experimenting on his own. He sat at his desk, staring at the power grid maps they had been working on earlier, his eyes tracing the complex web of electricity flowing through the country. The hum of the power in his veins seemed to match the rhythm of the flow of current in those lines. With a thought, he tried to focus, and to his shock, the map began to change. The lines on the screen shifted in real time, responding to his intentions. The circuits adapted to his will. His mind raced as he understood the scope of what had just happened. He wasn't just sensing energy anymore. He could control it. He could bend it to his will. At first, Huang thought it was just a fluke. A trick of the mind. But as the days went on, he found that he could control nearly everything around him: lights, power grids, even the electrical components in his own body. He could make light bulbs flash and screens flicker with the simplest thought. He could feel the energy in every wire he touched, every machine he interacted with. He had become a conduit, a living channel for the electricity that powered the world. His experimentation grew bolder as he pushed the limits of his newfound abilities. One night, he stood outside the research center, staring at the streetlight across the parking lot. He focused, and to his astonishment, the light dimmed and then flickered on, as though answering his silent command. The sensation was addicting, like a hidden power he had unlocked deep within himself. The next night, he pushed further, reaching out to the nearby power grid and sensing the surge of electricity coursing through the cables. He could feel the power plants miles away, their output rippling through the earth. It wasn't long before Huang realized that his abilities weren't just limited to electricity. He could feel the magnetic fields surrounding metal objects, the subtle pulses of energy that governed everything from the circuits in his phone to the force of gravity pulling on his body. It was as if he had become a part of the very fabric of the universe. By the time he was called in for a meeting with the Global Energy Council, Huang had learned to control his abilities, at least to a degree. The world was on the brink of an energy crisis, and governments everywhere were scrambling to find a solution. Huang's name had come up in the discussions, not just because of his reputation as a brilliant engineer, but because of his strange accident that had left him with the ability to manipulate electrical and magnetic forces. When the council's representatives arrived at his office, Huang had already prepared himself. He had heard the rumors, whispers that the world's energy infrastructure was on the verge of collapse, that entire nations were facing blackouts, and that the demand for power was rising at an unsustainable rate. The situation was dire. The global powers needed a solution. And they were looking at him. The representatives sat across from Huang in a sleek, modern conference room, their faces serious, their eyes intent. They explained the situation, how energy reserves were dwindling, how countries were on the brink of war over resources, and how no one seemed to have a viable answer to the crisis. "We've been monitoring your work here, Dr. Huang," one of the representatives said, a tall, stern woman named Dr. Linda Carter. "And it's become clear that you possess abilities that no one else does. Your ability to manipulate electricity and energy is exactly what we need to solve this crisis. We're offering you a position to help us develop solutions. The world's future depends on it." Huang listened, the weight of the world suddenly pressing down on his shoulders. He had been thrust into a role he never expected. They wanted him to use his power, not just to fix a few circuits, but to reshape the world's entire energy structure. The government and the private sector were counting on him to provide a solution to a problem that had never seemed more urgent. But as Huang sat there, listening to the promises of wealth, power, and influence, a nagging thought lingered at the back of his mind. The energy crisis was real, but something didn't sit right. This wasn't just about solving a technical problem. There was something more to it. Something darker. As he agreed to join the council's effort, Huang couldn't shake the feeling that he had just walked into a trap, one that would force him to confront the true cost of the power he now held. As the days passed, Huang's role with the Global Energy Council grew more intense. He moved into a high-security facility, a sleek building that housed some of the most brilliant minds in energy science. The work was demanding, and the expectations placed on him were immense. The world was teetering on the edge of collapse, and Huang, with his strange new abilities, was the only one who could offer a solution. But as much as he worked to restore power grids and stabilize failing energy sources, a growing unease gnawed at him. Every decision he made, every adjustment he recommended, felt like a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that he was only beginning to understand. He was a cog in a machine that was growing more and more disconcerting by the day. The more he learned about the global energy crisis, the more he saw its political and economic underpinnings. He had expected the council to be focused on solving the problem of energy shortages. Instead, he found himself surrounded by boardrooms full of powerful individuals who seemed more interested in profit margins and controlling the world's energy resources than in actually fixing the crisis. At first, Huang believed he was simply being paranoid. He had always prided himself on being meticulous and logical, but there was something about the council's approach that didn't sit right with him. Meetings were filled with vague talk about global energy security and strategic energy reserves, but nothing concrete ever came from the discussions. Everything felt like a game that was rigged from the start. One evening, after a long day of simulations and energy model testing, Huang sat alone in his office, staring out at the city below. The neon lights flickered in the distance, but the power seemed to pulse through the streets, steady and unyielding. He could feel it, the same way he felt the rhythm of his own heartbeat. But even as he marveled at the flow of electricity, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was being hidden from him. That night, Huang was summoned to a private meeting with Dr. Linda Carter. She was one of the highest-ranking members of the council, and her sharp, calculating demeanor had never sat well with him. She was a woman of few words, but every word she spoke carried the weight of decision. She was the kind of person who played the long game, and Huang had the sinking suspicion that he was part of it. When he arrived at her office, the door was already open, and Dr. Carter motioned for him to come in. The office was minimalist, as most government offices were, with clean lines, glass walls, and polished wood. It could have been any high-powered corporate space, but the subtle air of authority and intimidation hung in the air. "Dr. Huang, thank you for joining me," Dr. Carter said, her voice smooth and professional, though Huang could sense the tension underneath. "We need to talk about the future of energy distribution." "I thought that's what we've been doing for the last few weeks," Huang replied, trying to keep his voice casual. He could already tell that this conversation was going to be different from the others. "This is more urgent," she said, leaning forward slightly. "We're entering a new phase of the project, one that requires a bit more precision. Your abilities have exceeded our expectations. You've managed to stabilize several grids in record time. That's something no one else could do. But we need you to go further." Huang raised an eyebrow. "Go further?" Dr. Carter smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We need you to start manipulating energy on a larger scale. Power plants, entire cities. We need you to make the world's energy infrastructure bend to our will. The time for small fixes is over." Huang felt a chill slide down his spine. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was different. He had been thinking about the global energy crisis as a problem to be solved, but now he was being asked to use his powers to control it. He was no longer just fixing circuits or restoring power, he was being asked to play God. "You want me to control power?" Huang asked, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "To make the energy flow according to your demands?" "That's exactly what we need," Dr. Carter said, her tone unwavering. "You're the only one who can do it. You'll be at the center of a global effort to reshape energy distribution. We'll be able to control every aspect of the world's power grid. Think of it, the ability to direct energy wherever it's needed. No more shortages, no more crises. But at what cost?" Huang asked, his voice rising. "What happens to the people who won't have access to this directed power? What happens when you decide who gets energy and who doesn't?" Dr. Carter's smile tightened, and for a moment, there was a coldness in her eyes. "Dr. Huang, we're talking about the future of humanity. We're talking about global security, stability. It's bigger than individual access. You're not just fixing problems anymore. You're creating a new world." Huang stood there, frozen, as the weight of her words hit him. Creating a new world. It sounded so innocuous, so grand, but Huang could already see the implications. Control. Monopoly. The rich and powerful deciding who lived and who suffered. It was a vision of a future that could turn the world's population into nothing more than a commodity. A way to extract power from people without ever letting them have a say in how it was distributed. For the first time since this whole journey began, Huang realized he was standing on the edge of something dangerous. The very power that had given him the ability to change the world was the same power that could be used to enslave it. And as much as he tried to rationalize it, as much as he told himself that he could control it, the reality was sinking in. He wasn't just dealing with a global crisis, he was dealing with a power struggle, a political game that had already been decided long before he was recruited. "I can't do this," Huang said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't be the one to make those decisions. Not like this." Dr. Carter's expression darkened. "Don't be naive, Dr. Huang. You don't have a choice. This is the future, and you'll either be part of it or you'll be left behind." Huang turned and walked out of her office, the weight of her words heavy on his shoulders. As he left the building that night, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had entered this project hoping to help solve the world's energy crisis, but now he realized that he had become a pawn in a much larger game. The stakes were no longer just about power shortages and energy crises. The real battle was for control of the power itself, and Huang was at the center of it. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face, but it did little to calm his racing thoughts. The city was alive with energy, the hum of the power grid all around him. For the first time, he could feel the weight of it. The electricity in the air seemed to call to him, beckoning him to understand its full power. But now, he wasn't sure he wanted to. What was it worth to control everything? To play a part in reshaping the world's energy structure? Was it worth sacrificing his ideals and the future of the people he had sworn to help? He didn't know the answer. But he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't trust the council. He couldn't trust anyone who was playing this game. And as he walked through the city streets, feeling the pulse of the power beneath his feet, Huang made a silent vow to find the truth behind the energy crisis, no matter where it led. As Huang walked through the city, the hum of the power grid buzzed around him like an invisible cloud. The streets were alive with energy, but all he could think about was how little control he had over any of it. The words Dr. Carter had said echoed in his mind. "You don't have a choice. This is the future, and you'll either be part of it or left behind." He could feel the weight of those words pressing on him, suffocating him. How had it come to this? Just a few weeks ago, he had been a simple engineer, focused on circuits, wires, and the pursuit of better, cleaner energy for the world. Now, he was part of a system that saw energy as power to be controlled, distributed by the whims of the few, for the benefit of the few. It wasn't about solving a crisis anymore. It was about power. Power over everything. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash of light. He stopped in his tracks, squinting into the night. A nearby streetlight flickered, then went out completely. Huang's heart rate sped up, and instinctively, his hand reached out toward it. A gentle pulse of energy coursed from his fingertips, and the light flickered back to life. It wasn't just a response anymore, it was a direct extension of himself. He could feel the energy running through the bulb, the small surge of power, the flickering pulse that kept it alive. Huang's mind was racing. This wasn't just about fixing a grid or preventing blackouts. This was about something much bigger. Something that, as he had seen firsthand, could be manipulated. It could be used as a tool for control, a tool to break people down or build them up, depending on who held the reins. And right now, the reins were in the hands of people like Dr. Carter. People who saw the world's energy resources not as a shared lifeblood, but as a commodity to be bought, sold, and rationed for their own gain. He couldn't be a part of it anymore. He had to find another way. He had to fight back. The decision came swiftly, but the weight of it nearly crushed him. The technology that had made him an unwitting hero, the same technology that had given him the ability to manipulate electricity and control energy, was now his weapon. He could no longer pretend that this was just about solving a crisis. It was a fight for the very soul of humanity. Would the people who were suffering in power shortages, the people who lived without electricity, without heat, without access to the very resources that kept the world turning, continue to be silenced by the elites? Or would they fight back? Would he? The next day, Huang met with Mei in private. He knew he couldn't take on the Energy Council by himself, not with the government and the corporate forces aligned against him. But Mei had always been someone he trusted. Someone who had a sense of justice even when it was buried beneath the layers of bureaucracy and red tape. She was a scientist, a brilliant engineer, but she was also human. She could see the bigger picture. He found her in the small cafe they used to frequent when they were students, sitting in the back, her laptop open in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration. As soon as she saw him, she closed it with a soft snap, her expression turning serious. "Huang, what's going on?" she asked, her voice quiet, but her eyes sharp with concern. "I need your help," Huang said, taking a seat across from her. "The council is moving forward with something dangerous. And I'm not just talking about the energy crisis anymore. This is about control. If we don't stop them now, they'll use this crisis to solidify their power forever." Mei blinked in surprise, but then her expression softened as she leaned forward. "You're talking about the energy cartel? The one that's been controlling the global markets?" "Yes," Huang replied, his voice tight. "And it's worse than we thought. The shortage is manufactured, but that's just the beginning. They want to monopolize every aspect of the world's energy. They'll use this power to decide who gets energy, who doesn't, and when. They want to control everything. And I've become a part of that system." Mei's face hardened as she absorbed his words. "What are you planning to do?" "I don't know yet," Huang said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't just keep playing along. I can't be a tool for them, Mei. I need to use my abilities to fight back. But I can't do it alone." Mei looked at him for a long moment, her lips pressed together in thought. Finally, she nodded. "All right. I'll help. But this isn't just about stopping the council. We need to expose them. We need to let people see the truth." Huang could feel the weight of their decision settling in, but for the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. They weren't alone. They weren't powerless. That night, Huang began making his plans. He couldn't take on the global energy cartel head-on, not yet, not without the right information, the right allies. But he could begin to strike at the heart of their operations, start small, expose cracks in the system. The first step was to get access to their data, their communications, their financial records. He needed proof of the conspiracy. Proof that the energy crisis was a deliberate act. Using his abilities, he hacked into the network, bypassing firewalls and security protocols as though they were nothing more than cobwebs. It wasn't as simple as flicking a switch, it took all his concentration, but the data he accessed was enough to make his blood run cold. There, right in front of him, was the evidence: deals made behind closed doors, prices artificially inflated, entire regions of the world deprived of energy while the cartel sold it at a premium to the highest bidder. He copied the data, encrypting it in several layers to ensure it couldn't be traced back to him. The data wasn't enough yet, though. Huang needed more. He needed the names of those responsible, the key players pulling the strings behind the curtain. He needed to take the fight straight to them, but there was a catch. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. The cartel had eyes everywhere. They weren't just powerful, they were ruthless. Huang wasn't just hacking into a network anymore, he was hacking into the veins of a system that had the power to destroy him, to erase him without a second thought. Despite the fear gnawing at him, Huang knew he had no choice. The truth had to be exposed, even if it meant risking everything. He wasn't going to sit back and let the system crush the lives of millions just to line the pockets of the elite. He had power now. He could control the current. He could bend the flow of energy to his will. It was time to fight back. The next few weeks were a blur of action and adrenaline. Huang worked tirelessly with Mei, building a network of allies, disgruntled engineers, hackers, and anyone who had seen the truth and was ready to fight for it. They began striking at the cartel's weak points, exposing their operations piece by piece. They leaked information, sabotaged their networks, and orchestrated small-scale rebellions, all the while keeping their true identities hidden. The world didn't know it yet, but a revolution was coming. It was only a matter of time before the cartel would be forced to answer for their actions, but Huang knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They were up against a machine that had been built over decades. The power they were fighting for wasn't just electricity, it was control. And as he looked out over the city, the hum of the power grid resonating in his mind, Huang knew one thing for certain: the battle was just beginning.